Colleagues, we're so pleased that all of you could join us today for this online panel entitled Women Who Shaped the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the Sidelines of the Commission for the Status of Women. My name is Jayashree Wyatt. I'm the Chief of Education Outreach in the Outreach Division in the Department of Global Communications at the UN and moderating this event today. Before I begin, if I may, I'll just share a couple of quick housekeeping matters. The event today is being recorded. We will share a link to the recording with all participants after the meeting. And just due to the large number of participants, all your camera feeds and speaker audio have been temporarily deactivated. You may, however, interact with our panelists by typing your questions into the Q&A window. The Q&A, of course, will be moderated, and we ask that you please only submit your question one time. We'll do our very best to answer all of your questions during the Q&A. Thank you. So this event, I'm very pleased to share with you, is being organized by the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative, the UN Human Rights Office, and the Human Rights Team of the UN Department of Global Communications in the context of the 69th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. We'd also like to very much thank Meharry Medical College from the state of Tennessee for their collaboration on the event. The UNAI initiative of the global communications at the UN engages higher institutions of education with the United Nations principles and also with the Sustainable Development Goals. We currently host a network of over 1,700 universities in over 150 countries. So each year on the sidelines of the Commission on the Status of Women, the UNAI has been organizing a side event to advance the implementation of SDG 5, really focusing on gender equality and empowerment of girls and women, because the rights of girls and women, these are human rights. And this year, the Secretary General opened the two-week meeting, which marked 30 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, highlighting the undeniable progress which has taken place alongside the immense gaps that still remain. And in light of the enormous obstacles we are currently facing, it is all the more important that we remain firm in defending and continue to work together to create equality for all women and girls, and especially the women and girls who are most vulnerable. In the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, equality for women and girls is a human right. It is a matter of justice. It is the foundation of sustainable development and lasting peace, and it is essential for humanity. It is now our pleasure to welcome the Assistant Secretary General, Ms. Ilse Brands-Karas. She works for the United Nations Human Rights Office, and she combines extensive expertise in political science, conflict prevention, and human rights. ASG, we're so pleased to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. Dear colleagues and friends, it's really a great pleasure to join you today as we are celebrating truly inspiring and diverse women whose work on human rights and gender equality is still felt to this very day. And certainly we know how much that is needed. It's well timed that we're meeting around the Commission on the Status of Women, which, as you know, has human rights at its core and even predates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as it met for the first time in 1947. The Commission drafted the early international conventions on women's rights, including the 1953 Convention on the Political Rights of Women. The exceptional group of speakers here today will tell you in detail the significant contributions these women from across the world have made to the world through their work on the UDHR. They were pioneers in recognizing a truth that I'm sure all of us here hold dear, that women's rights are human rights. That is at the heart of another milestone document we're celebrating at this event today, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Its adoption 30 years ago led to undeniable progress. Since then, more than 160 countries have passed laws to address domestic violence. The number of women in parliaments globally has more than doubled, and 50 million more girls have been enrolled in schools globally since 2015. While these hard-won gains should be rightly celebrated, we know that we are very far from where we want and need to be. Violence against women is a persistent scourge. It happens in times of peace and conflict, offline and online. A recent report from UN Women and UNODC indicates that one woman or girl is killed every 10 minutes by their intimate partner or family member. In 2023, the proportion of women killed in armed conflict doubled compared to the previous year, and the number of UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence grew by 50%. Alarming. Everywhere, women's rights are being delayed, dismissed, and denied. This is a dreadful human rights failure and extremely short-sighted given that women and girls represent half of the world's population. Today, we are at crossroads. We need to bring back the energy and the values of both the Beijing Declaration and the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, recently told the Human Rights Council, we need to send a clear message that there is no going backwards. Women's rights are human rights, and resurgent gender-based violence, discrimination, and misogyny have no place in our world. That is why events like the one today are so important, to inspire us, to remind us that progress is possible, and to move us towards action. The UN Human Rights Office is committed to this. In Mexico, we're backing the fight against impunity in cases of femicide. In Colombia, we're supported peacekeeping activities with women at their core. We're working to increase the participation of women in decision-making in South Sudan. And in Ukraine, we're supporting women survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Those are only a few examples. We will continue our work for gender equality around the world, celebrating diversity, insisting on bodily autonomy, pressing for more women at decision-making tables. Within the broader human rights ecosystem, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which grew directly out of CSW, which is often forgotten, is an invaluable tool for the women to resist and address discrimination, violence, poverty, and lack of legal protections. Let me give you two concrete examples. At this very moment, CEDAW is working on a new draft general recommendation on how states can combat gender stereotypes. And just the end of last year, CEDAW adopted a groundbreaking document called General Recommendation Number 40 on the equal and inclusive representation of women in decision-making systems. The general recommendation moves us beyond outdated targets and affirms that only full 50-50 parity aligns with women's right to be free from discrimination and to achieve substantive equality. It clearly states that equality means shared power in all its forms. It recognizes that women's equal and inclusive representation in decision-making is directly linked to the full realization of their rights. And it demonstrates that full and effective participation and women's leadership is not just a right, but a powerful tool for tackling the global challenges of our time. I'm sure that the presentations and discussions today will reinvigorate our path to, and guided by the women that shaped UDHR, towards women's rights and gender equality in our work every day at every opportunity. I thank you, and I look forward to listening to the discussions to come.
Thank you very much, ASG Ilse Brands-Karas, for your powerful remarks and reminding us how much work still needs to be done, but that progress really is possible, and how important it is for women to be in roles of leadership. So thank you very much indeed for your remarks. It is now my pleasure to pass the floor to Ms. Nanette Braun. She is the Director of Campaigns and Country Operations Division in the United Nations Department of Global Communications. And prior to her current appointment, Ms. Braun headed the Communications and Public Advocacy Departments at UN Women. the Women's Rights Organization of the UN, and at UN Volunteers. Ms. Braun, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jayashri, and a warm welcome also from me to this special event dedicated, excuse me, please, to celebrating the remarkable women who were essential in creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I am so sorry, it's still early in the day here in New York. My apologies. And a special thanks also to my colleagues from the department and from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for organizing this event. We have just heard it. The event is held at a time when women's rights around the world are under threat. No less than a quarter of governments worldwide reported a backlash in 2024. And this is according to UN Women's latest report, Women's Rights in Review 30 Years After Beijing, which was just published ahead of CSW. And this includes higher levels of discrimination, weaker legal protections, and reduced funding for programs and institutions that support and protect women. At the United Nations, our commitment as a champion of women's rights stands firm and translates daily into our work. And important progress has been made. In 1979, CEDAW, also dubbed the International Bill of Women's Rights, was adopted at the UN, and we just heard coming straight out of the CSW, and it was adopted as a legally binding treaty outlining the rights of women and the obligations of states to protect them. The 1993 UN General Assembly Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women cemented the understanding that the pandemic of violence that affects women worldwide is not a private matter, but that a life free of such violence is every woman's rights. And the majority of countries have today adopted legislation to protect women from violence. Women's important role in the peace and security arena has been recognized. We are also commemorating the 25th anniversary of the pivotal Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security this year. And a number of follow-up resolutions have in particular aimed to address the horror of sexual and gender-based violence in conflicts. Foundational UN agreements like these guide the UN's work on the ground in countries around the world. And at the UN Department of Global Communications, we are advocating for advancing gender equality and fostering global awareness of the progress achieved through global campaigns and by amplifying women's voices and their own stories. I have myself had the opportunity to witness and support some of these efforts over the years. I started with the UN just before the Beijing conference. My first travel was to New York to the PrepCom for Beijing. And later, I joined UN Women, the UN organization dedicated to women's empowerment and rights, when it was established after decades of persistent and energetic advocacy by women's rights advocates. Yet it is deeply frustrating that despite many breakthroughs, progress overall has been much too slow, and gains that have been made are now at risk of being turned back. So as we are about to hear from our distinguished speakers, let's not only remember the trailblazing women working on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but build on their legacy and be inspired by their dedication and energy for our and for future generations. And with this, I would like to hand back over to my colleague, Jayashri, to moderate the panel of our distinguished speakers, to which I look much forward to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nanette, for these rich comments. Both you and the ASG have really helped to set the groundwork for this conversation. And I really appreciate your insights about the obligation of states to protect women's rights. I think that was a really important insight as we move into the next part of our conversation. And we will continue today now hearing from 4 leaders and scholars on the significant contributions of women in the drafting and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Beijing interventions. We'll hear about some of the challenges they faced and the profound impact of their work in terms of gender equality movements of today. So please, first, I would like to introduce Ambassador Gertrude Mongella. We are so honored to have you, Excellency. You have kindly agreed to start our discussion this morning. And Ambassador Mongella, you were the Secretary General of the Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing in 1995. And as an educator, a defender of women's rights, a politician, and a diplomat, Ambassador Mongella, you continue to be committed to the political integration of Africa, as well as championing a strong involvement of women in political leadership. So we welcome you today. We are just so honored and privileged to have you with us. So if I may, I'd like to start with our first question. Ambassador, you are known as Mama Beijing, and you are known with this beautiful, epitaph because of the role you played as the Secretary General of the UN World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. And I wonder if you could share with us this morning what you think some of the main achievements of that conference were, and why that conference was so instrumental to the fight and the work for women's rights today. Over to you, Excellency.
Good morning, all of you. I'm so happy to be here with you today, and I wanted to acknowledge the good work of preparation done by the organizers. I come from Tanzania, Africa, East Africa, and today I would like to say it is really I have a feeling of happiness to see that I'm alive 30 years from Beijing, and that we have managed to see some of the changes. I come from a more positive side of the implementation of the platform for action. The platform for action was a document adopted without brackets, if I use the language of the UN, without brackets at the end of the conference, which was a big success. And it was due to the commitment in the preparations and the commitment of all stakeholders who were there in Beijing representing different nations, governments, and NGOs. I want to say I speak from a positive point by just recalling how people in the part of the world where we are, we walk long distances. We walk long distances. We don't drive so much. Most of us don't drive. We walk. And once you start walking, you might also know you are going a long distance, but that will not stop you from from walking and going to the destination you want to go to. So from that point of view, I want to tell you, first thing, I'm very proud to come from Tanzania, where we have a woman president who is doing a good job. We are happy about it. And we are going to vote her in again in October because we want her to continue, and we want people to know that women can do it. But I have also experienced changes in many countries where the laws have been reformed, the legal systems have been restructured, the education and the health systems have changed. We have fewer women dying of childbirth today than we had 30 years ago. So I can mention a lot of things using my own country that, for example, now a woman can own land. something which was unthinkable 30 years ago. Women can go to school without questions. Women can take any job. We have women miners, women in the fishing area, women in, you name it, areas where we're told it was a taboo. It was a taboo for a woman to go hunting. And now we have even the people who protect in the national parks, the soldiers are women. So we are doing so much. We have a woman in law, I mean, a woman in a position of a minister for defense, something which you never thought of. How can you manage the soldiers as a woman? So we are starting to see changes. So as I said, we are walking. We have not despaired. We have to continue walking. The speed is slow, and sometimes it becomes slower when you have walked a long distance. You get tired, stressed, exhausted, but you cannot stop walking. So I'm saying, let us keep on walking. We still have to cover a long distance, but we are in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I really appreciate your insights that, women are really breaking these taboos and moving into these leadership roles and realms where they previously were not. And I especially appreciate your words of encouragement to all of us that we must continue walking towards this destination, even if sometimes the walk is difficult or slow. This is really very much appreciated. So next, if I may, I will move to Mrs. Anna Fierst. She is the great granddaughter of Eleanor Roosevelt and the daughter of Mrs. Roosevelt's eldest grandchild, Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves. She now chairs the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Val-Kill to promote the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as well as currently serving as the vice chair of the National Women's Foundation, an organization that promotes women's history, youth voting, and civic engagement. So we welcome you, Mrs. Fierce.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here and be with such a distinguished group of women. And I don't often get a chance to ask kind of one of the questions that this is based on is discovering, and I was trying to do some research before I began on my questions that were assigned to me, really get into the background on the core group of women who were working with my great-grandmother, aside from Hansa Mehta, who is referenced occasionally, but there were many other women, and they are almost never mentioned. And I have looked through my primary sources, and I kept thinking, well, they're here somewhere, but I can't run up to the UN to look in your archives. So I'm hoping that I will hear a lot more about. I know at least about 6 others who worked extensively with her and were great assistants, aside from the 4 or 5 men, of course, who she helped steer on that Commission of Human Rights. So I just want to get back a little bit. I loved the ambassador's analogy about the long journey and beginning and a sort of a remote place, and you had this destination that's a long way. And I think ER saw that very much as how this was all going to unfold. If she could have lived to be 140 years old, she would not have been surprised to see the kind of, up and down progress that women have made since the creation of the UDHR and since really the 50s when she was continued to be active in the UN. I just want to get back a little bit even farther prior to 1948. And what is often sort of lost in this big picture is how ER and FDR, and again, in this sense of women not getting credit, FDR's famous For Freedom speech was a speech that she very much worked on with him and promoted, and that is really probably maybe of the two or three, and he gave a lot of speeches. That is probably probably the most famous one, I think. And it ushered in and led to the Atlantic Charter. The war's end was the goal of this, the four freedoms, and in their heads, the heads of FDR and ER, at the end of this, we could not have another League of Nations disaster, which of course was World War I. So the idea was to create this and build towards that. So when Truman appointed ER to that role, he not only was, it was a very smart political move, but he also knew that had bought into it at that point. What the whole framework by which human rights could be measured, and more specifically, where and how could these rights be implemented within a country's own culture, was something I think ER was very, very aware of, having traveled around the world during the war and traveled, and all sorts of places where she could see that cultural differences would have great impacts on how rights were awarded to people. Having said that, all the founders beyond the creation of the UDHR would be very saddened to see how nations have, in the interest of sheer expediency, have obscured the Declaration's message that rights have conditions and that everyone's rights are conditioned on the respect for the rights of others. However, on that sort of B minor note, as they say in French, however, I still believe the importance of the rule of law and the health of civil society is a key area, because this was part of my question, where the UDHR continues to influence today. And it's not as though when I go about, I talk about this, people often aren't aware that this is a document that's still living and breathing in some fashion. Mm-hmm. They'll say, oh, well, yeah, that's right. I think I did hear about that. The impact is one of these kind of soft impacts. But it continues to have impact today. And I think that's one of the key areas. She could not have predicted, and this gets back to another part of the second question I was asked, the fragmentation of countries that have happened since 1948. Obviously, a lot of decolonization had happened. Countries were born, emerged, and there's a lot of since then, since her death, a great deal, I would say, of intra-country conflicts obviously have taken place. She could not have predicted that, of course, or really much more out there for her in her own head was the impact of technology on social welfare and social connections. And she was a huge social connector. I mean, you'll hear how she operated. She hated the telephone. Now, can you imagine the pick up, the dial, the old fashioned? So she hated television, and yet she was on TV. But she said, when people get on TV, they stop talking to each other. Or when a family is in that community, nobody's talking to each other. Neighbors are not talking to each other. So where we have gone in a global sense with hiding behind technology is something that I think would be quite discouraging for her. And she would say to us now, your challenge is to find your way out of that, for us to find our way out of that box that we have put ourselves in. So to touch briefly on the world context, this is another question, 1948. How has it differed or is the same? In general, societies, including our own, fail to appreciate the basic fact that economic security is tied to the freedom to express and develop human rights. And without that kind of security, there's really, within a community or a country, things like basic health care. And I sort of have in my mind many of the articles from the UDHR. So take basic health care. Well, that's not going to happen if you don't have economic security. Daughters get married off at young ages if families are impoverished. School fees don't get paid. So, lack of education continues from one generation to the next. So those are, that's something that is still true, was true then, and is true today. So what is primarily different, of course, from what is the situation in 48 and continuing into the 50s, marginalized communities were often not in a position at that point to demand and basically encourage within their own communities the rights that were spelled out in the UDHR. And following, as I mentioned earlier, decolonization and the whole political reordering that happened, societies basically that had managed to agree on paper and in principle to the basic tenets of good government, because the ruling status quo said, well, this is what's going to happen. And some of this political reordering basically did away with some of that stability for a while. Sometimes it came back, sometimes it did not. And obviously, I'm just thinking about the status of China in 1948. So she could, all of these things that have happened in terms of China becoming basically a superpower now were not things that were on her radar screen. And of course, obviously, then it was the rise of communism, which she became very, very, was very disturbed about. And of course, disturbed about it in how the repression of speech happened in the 1950s in this country. She was very much struggled against that, against McCarthyism. So I just want to say the other question I had about gender rights here, because that is really the pertinent subject. In my own life, and we mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Val Kill, we're doing a program. We have a couple of different things coming up, but immediately we have a program or panel discussion on the censorship and freedom of expression and intellectual freedom. And that is something that's going to happen in a few months. And then we have an annual awards ceremony now based on the subject of banned books. So that is an important thing we're doing. And also we're redeveloping another program that lapsed during COVID. And in terms of National Women's Foundation, that is, again, that's something that deals a lot with women's history, but we also I'm very happy with the fact that in about 2 weeks, we're going to have a very famous Nigerian author speaking to several hundred of women will be coming from the Washington area to hear this Chimamanda Adichie. Some of you might know her works, and her latest book, and I don't work for her publishing house, but it is called Dream Count, and it is about women and mothers and daughters and the effects of emigrating and going back to Nigeria and the conflicts that women face in those, and a little bit in Nigeria, but also, excuse me, here in this country. And on a very personal note, let me get a little coffee here. You asked how I support gender rights. Well, when high school, as a 16-year-old, I got in a lot of trouble for promoting the better education on birth control in the school, in high school. And,
Yeah.
So, and this is some time ago, so this was not a subject. Now you go, well, of course. But anyway, I had to shut that program down when the school superintendent told me I would either be kicked out but so I've been sort of focused on women's issues, I think, ever since about 7th grade. So what I've been doing is really heading up organizations. The Women's National Democratic Club is another one that deal with promoting women, and especially the latter one I just mentioned, promoting the role of women in political life. So I'm going to stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mrs. Fierst. I really think that the work that you're doing to carry on this legacy is so important. And I think, your point also about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being a living and breathing document. And it creates this extraordinary framework that the entire world, is looking to understand, right, how we can implement these human rights. And I think your point also around economic freedom being, so tied to the capacity to build out human rights is very well taken as well. So we thank you very much for your intervention. And now, if I may, yes, thank you indeed. We'd like to watch a quick UN archival footage video highlighting women's contribution to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if I could ask our good colleagues on the technical side to cue that up and play it. Well, thank you, colleagues, very much for sharing that video. I think that just really illustrates the point that Mrs. Fierce was making when she first started, which was that there were many women that contributed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we saw in that video contributions also to the Charter. And when women leaders are at the table, this is what they're able to actually do. So we thank you again, Mrs. Fierce, for your excellent intervention, and we thank the colleagues for sharing that video with us as well. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rebecca Adame. She's a professor and senior researcher at Stockholm University, Sweden, specializing in human rights studies on women and UN history, cosmopolitanism and ethics and children's rights. She is the author of Women and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Dr. Adame also received the 2022 Bertha Lutz Prize for highest quality public writing and research on women in diplomacy from the Diplomatic Studies section of the International Studies Association. So, Dr. Adame, we're very pleased to have you. You're an expert scholar in this arena. We've shared a number of questions with you, and just for our audience, we've got a couple here. Who are the women in addition to Mrs. Roosevelt who helped to draft the UDHR? And can you tell us a little bit more about their contributions to gender equality and international human rights? We'll see how our time goes as well. So please, the floor is yours, Dr. Adame.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. So I've been working. I worked for over 6 years, from 2012 to 2018, with a book titled Women and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so my research is built on some archival work that I did at the UN Archives and Library, the Roosevelt Library, also using memoirs of several of the women involved. I will only be able to mention some of the women here. So for those of you who are interested in knowing more about the whole process of drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, please read the book. It's available open access online. So it's Women and the Universal Declaration. But so this process, it took over 2 years for the different drafts of the declaration to be voted through. And some of the women that I will mention here, you've seen in that short clip by the United Nations. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights went through different bodies at the United Nations. So starting with some of the first drafts in the drafting committee, where Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair, being discussed in the Human Rights Commission, also being debated by the Commission on the Status of Women, then going to the third committee, and then later being adopted in the General Assembly in December 1948. So I will focus on some of the negotiations and discussions that occurred in the third committee. So this was the last phase of the discussions. So we need to be reminded here that Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, she'd been chair and she'd listened tirelessly to some of the debates and conflicts between different delegates. So she was very eager to get the declaration adopted by all the member states. And some of the instances where she went against the idea of gender equality in being mentioned in the declaration might have been due to the fact that she was really eager to having the declaration being adopted and not being voted down by other member states. I will focus on three of the articles that I think are really important in the declaration in relation to gender equality. Article 16 on equal rights in marriage and at its dissolution, so in divorce. Article 23 on equal rights to equal pay for equal work for women. And Article 26 on the rights in education and including minority rights. And some of the women who were participating, I'm going to mention Shaista Ikramullah that you saw from Pakistan. Pakistan had gained independence from Great Britain's colonial rule in 1947. Lakshmi Menon, that you also saw in the General Assembly where she held a speech, she was from India, and India also gained their independence from colonial British rule in 1947. Minerva Benedino from Dominican Republic. You saw her with a big fancy hat in the video. Miss Zuluaga from Venezuela. She was not part of the video, but she was representing Venezuela for the Commission on the Status of Women in the Third Committee. Bodil Begtrup from Denmark, and Fredrika Kalinowska from Poland. As you know, Poland had been occupied by Nazi German occupation. So already here you see that Shaista Ikramullah, Lakshmi Menon, Fredrika Kalinowska, they shared experiences of how women's rights had been limited during different types of occupation and colonial rule. We also had Eleanor Roosevelt from the US and Marjorie Ashby from the UK in the Third Committee. And some of the main differences in the stance between women in the Third Committee were actually between Western female delegates from the UK and the US and the other women that I'm going to mention. So first of all, the preamble. There was a discussion whether in the Third Committee, should the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights repeat the idea that women and men are equal in dignity? The draft that was being discussed in the Third Committee, that had been drafted and discussed in the Human Rights Commission, had omitted the mentioning of gender equality in the preamble. And Minerva Benedino from the Dominican Republic, she suggested an amendment to the preamble that you needed to explicitly mention equality of women and men in the preamble, because that was really important for the whole idea of human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt at this point said that it was enough to state everyone, and that the time had come to see women as in being included in that kind of wording. But Lakshmi Menon from India, she reminded the chair that it's really important to explicitly mention gender equality in any legislation, because there's always this judicial interpretation that can lead to women being excluded from the idea of civil rights. And she actually gave the example of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution as an example of the importance to explicitly mention people who might otherwise be excluded from ideas of civil rights or human rights. Gender equality was later being included in the preamble, and the suggestion by Minerva Benedino from Dominican Republic was voted through. Then Article 16, this was a very sensitive article because it had in earlier drafts included a mentioning of divorce, so women's right to divorce. And international organizations such as the International Union of Catholic Women's Leagues and the International Federation of Christian Trades Unions, they had urged the Human Rights Commission to please respect human opinions and Christian principles, to protect the family and admit that equality encompasses divorce. They did not want a Universal Declaration of Human Rights to be a declaration that mentioned the idea of divorce. In this instance, Eleanor Roosevelt, as representing the US, wanted Article 16 to be deleted from the declaration because this was rights in the private sphere, and it was unnecessary to have that kind of article in the declaration. The US was the only member state that voted, was one of the the member states that voted against this idea to have gender equality being mentioned in Article 16. And here you saw this kind of tension in the third committee between delegations and countries who wished for the formulations and the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to have a rather progressive formulations, to have a progressive language, because they wanted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to possibly influence national legislation in different countries. So it was not that, Minerva Bernardino from Dominican Republic and Miss Zulaga from Venezuela, that they were representing countries where women's rights were being respected and had full legal support. It was more that they had this faith in the declaration for it to actually influence national legislation. Whereas other member states wanted the declaration to reflect the sentiments and the legislation in member states at the time. So the ideas diverged there. And Minerva Bernardino and Bodil Begtrup and Zulaga from Venezuela, they argued that it was really important to ensure that you would mention that women would have equal rights to divorce as men, because in different countries, national legislation did not permit women to divorce on with the same motives as they permitted men to file for divorce. And as you know, here once again, the women delegates who represented the Commission on the Status of Women, they were successful in their argumentation in the third committee, and today we have an Article 16 mentioning equal rights in marriage and at its dissolution. So that was. I also wanted to mention Article 23. Because here it was a little bit frustrating for the delegations, because all paragraphs of Article 23 on equal pay for equal work were being adopted, but then as a whole, the article was being rejected. UK and the US were against the mentioning equal pay for equal work, and Lakshmi Menon asked what was the real reason for repeat a clause dealing with non-discrimination in this article. She asked this in the meeting because the argument by delegations, by Marjorie Corbett, for example, and Eleanor Roosevelt, was that it was unnecessary to repeat non-discrimination in different articles because it would be too repetitive, or that it was unnecessary because you already have that protection in Article 2 of the Declaration. And Lakshmi Menon from India said that it might be that it was difficult for colonial powers to share the feelings of those who for centuries had suffered from discrimination. And she thought that that was maybe some of the sentiments that influenced argumentation. She disagreed here with Eleanor Roosevelt that everyone meant every human being. And she said that in many countries it would be understood as applying only to men, and in other as only applying to white men and women. And Minerva Bernardino, she agreed with Lakshmi Menon from India, and she said that it was important to have equal pay for equal work to be explicitly stated, because it should apply to all without any distinction. It was voted through, the suggestion to have this mentioning in Article 23, with 39 voting for the article at the end, and just the US voting against due to non-discrimination being mentioned in the article. So there were some agreements and some disagreements between the women delegates at the time. So lastly, I just also wanted to say something about Article 26 on the right to education, because here again, there were some differences in argumentation in the third committee discussing the Universal Declaration. So Bodil Begtre from Denmark, she made a suggestion that this article on the right to education should include rights for minority groups. And she had to actually withdraw her suggestion to the article because this was a very sensitive topic. A lot of the delegates felt that education, if you mentioned rights for minority groups, that could create instability in countries. Shaista Ikramullah from Pakistan, she was rather disappointed in the discussions. She writes in the memoirs that it reminded her of her own struggles in Pakistan at the time. She had put a lot of faith that the new government, the new assembly in Pakistan, that they would be very for like liberal notions of education and democratic ideas of education, because they had fought so fiercely for independence, for democracy from colonial rule of Great Britain. And she found, that her education minister in Pakistan was against her in all the debates. He wanted education to be a way to, in her view, indoctrinate a new generation of people. So religious indoctrination, political indoctrination. She was really disappointed, and she was also a little bit disappointed that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not fully mention the importance of respecting minority rights to education. And her sentiments were also felt by Fredrika Kalinowska from Poland, who had similar experiences in Poland, both, wanting to be independent from the Soviet Union, but also having been occupied by the Nazi German. But one really great accomplishment in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it comes to the right to education was when Miss Zuluaga from Venezuela said that she really wanted the Commission on the Status of Women's idea that this should mention that the right to education is an education that should educate about human rights and for peace, and that it should be free and compulsory for everyone. And this suggestion was voted through. So the Declaration of Human Rights has the same kind of formulation about education as does UNESCO, talking about education for human rights and for lasting peace. Yes, so I think that was some of the main difficulties that I wanted to share, because it was not just a smooth process to have this universal declaration adopted. It was a rather difficult one, and the Commission on the Status of Women wanted, for example, the language to be a little bit more gender neutral, to not have his and him being repeated and used throughout the articles, whereas other delegates, even women, said that, well, his and him refers to women, and everyone should know that women are included in that kind of wording. Fredrika Kalinowska said that she had thought that, for example, Marjorie Corbett Ashby as a woman would stand behind all suggestions that could increase women's rights in the declaration. But here again, it was a difficult process because representatives from very big delegations, they also needed to be kind of sensitive to the fact that they were steering a document where they wanted as many member states as possible to actually stand behind the declaration. So again, it was challenging, I think, process for everyone involved.
Jayashri, you are muted.
Okay, there we are. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
And excellent, thank you. Sorry, the room settings had changed. Thank you so much, Dr. Adame, for the rich engagement that you shared, the back and forth. And I think some of these debates that you're actually pointing out around the language. And I think the importance, right, of Hansa Mehta's position, which is you have to be explicit about it, because otherwise these groups can be easily marginalized and left out. And I think that back and forth and the kind of real politic that you're also pointing to about how do you get this through committee, right, with enough consensus and people online. And it just really shows the kind of, you know, intense work that they were engaged in. So we really thank you for this very informative background. And I think these debates are ones that are still continuing today about language. So it's really, really interesting. We thank you so much. So now, if I may, I'd like to turn, we're going to be watching another quick video clip before our last speaker, Professor Bhagavan. And this is footage from the UN archives about the first woman president of the United Nations General Assembly, Madam Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. So colleagues, if I could ask you to play the video and share with everyone on the line.
Votes have been cast as follows. Madam Pandit, 37. Prince Juan, 22.
I should like to express my deep appreciation to my fellow representatives for the great honor they have just conferred upon me. They can be certain that I shall do my best to justify their confidence and to discharge impartially the responsibilities of this high office. I regard your choice as a tribute to my country and a recognition of her profound desire to serve the purposes of the United Nations and through them the paramount interests of world peace. It is also a recognition of the part that women have played and are playing in furthering the aims and purposes of this great organization. We have the duty not merely to restore peace when it is broken, but even more to prevent peace from being threatened. We must seek to eliminate weapons of mass destruction rather than invent weapons which are even more destructive. Finally, we must discover a means of directing the resources of industry and the researches of science into peaceful instead of destructive channels. We must learn to cooperate effectively in safeguarding peace and in raising standards of living of peoples of the world.
Great. I just love this footage that our amazing UN video colleagues, you know, keep pulling out from our amazing set of archives here at the UN. It really helps us to continue to keep alive this important story about the critical interventions and roles that women played in some of the earliest moments of the United Nations. So now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Manu Bhagavan. He authored the biography of Madame Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. He is a professor of history, human rights, and public policy at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. He's also senior fellow at the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies. So it's our pleasure to welcome you today. And we're really interested to hear from you a little bit more about what inspired you to really write about the first woman president of the UN General Assembly and what you hope readers can take away from her contributions to gender equality and non-discrimination worldwide. So please, Professor Bhagavan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jayashree, and thank you to all of the organizers for putting this important event together. It seems more important now than ever. And thank you all to my fellow panelists. It's quite an honor to be with you this morning. I've written the biography of Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who's known worldwide as Madam Pandit, as the introductory video highlighted. And I sort of got involved with her story because she appeared as a character in my previous book, which focused on India's views on human rights and on its role in the construction of international human rights. That book was called The Peacemakers. And she kind of leapt off of the page immediately for having just quite an enormous personality. And she was funny, she was witty, she was charming, and she was most of all brilliant. It was just so striking. I mean, she just commanded the page. I was writing it, but she was in charge. I mean, you know, she just sort of assumed command of the page immediately. So I was very much struck by this, and after it was over, I was working on something else, and I just suddenly one day kind of turned to my family and I said, you know, actually what I'm interested in doing is writing a biography of Vijayalakshmi Pandit, and gosh, I would love to do it for Penguin. It was a very random thought that I said, and then just about a week later, I got an email from Penguin inviting me to write a biography of her. And so I thought the universe had spoken, and that is exactly what I did. So let me just tell you a little bit about her and why she's important and address the question. So as I got involved with her story, I found she's truly quite remarkable. Yes, she's the first woman president of the UN General Assembly, but she's quite a bit more. She was, for example, a president of the All India Women's Conference. She was India's first woman cabinet minister, and she was the first woman cabinet minister in the British Empire to hold significant portfolios of power. She was India's first ambassador to the United Nations. She was India's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. She was the first woman ambassador to the United States of America. As we've already noted, she was the first woman president of the UN General Assembly, and she was the first woman ambassador, technically high commissioner, to the United Kingdom. This is a woman who broke barriers, a pioneer in everything that she did. But these titles don't really capture her or what she accomplished. So, for example, in her time in India, she really focused much of her energy on working on women's health, creating mobile health clinics, nursing, and providing educational access to women and girls. And she sort of innovated how to make this approachable to families who otherwise might not be keen. She was involved with things like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She worked with Eleanor Roosevelt. She worked with Margaret Sanger. She worked with Madam Chang and a whole list of other illustrious figures. But let me kind of give you a couple of more concrete anecdotes that I think help to illustrate some of what she managed to do in her time. So one was that as ambassador to the United States, she attracted quite a bit of attention and became a world figure. She was world renowned in her day. She became friends with a woman named Pearl Mehta. Pearl Mehta is someone who many of you may know because there was a rather famous musical based on a book called Call Me Madam. And there was a song in there by Irving Berlin called "The Hostess with the Mostess," referring to Pearl Mehta. Pearl Mehta met Madam Pandit when she initially became the ambassador. They became close friends, but meanwhile, the press was really talking about the fact that women were no longer going to be silent on the sidelines or accept minor positions, because Madam Pandit was the person who was showing that you had to have an important seat at the table and that there was substantive work to be done. And the net result of that was that Pearl Mehta became the United States ambassador to Luxembourg, and only the third woman to hold that kind of a post. And Madam Pandit was sort of credited with helping to make that to happen. Another speaker mentioned McCarthyism earlier. So Madam Pandit was an ambassador in the United States at the height of McCarthyism and while the hearings were going on at the Tidings Committee. So one of the people that they subjected to questioning was Judge Dorothy Kenyon, who was one of the most important pioneers in American jurisprudence and the person who mentors Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who goes on to become important on the U.S. Supreme Court. So while they're grilling her, Madam Pandit is there, and she's a foreign dignitary, so there isn't much that she can do, but she thought that this kind of course was dangerous and could lead to disaster. So what she managed to do in a very subtle way was to show up and sit in the in sort of the audience box, but that attracted a ton of attention, and she got photographed for that. And she, when asked about it, she ended up talking about these kinds of problems as they appeared in her own country. So she didn't speak directly to the issue, but the message came across that we must always be wary of witch hunts. That's a poor choice of words, I think, but that's in general, these things are dangerous pursuits where you pick figures to marginalize and target. Okay, so specifically related to human rights and gender and racial equality, and more broadly with her work with the United Nations, Vijayalakshmi Pandit was involved from the very beginning. She led the counter delegation to the San Francisco conference to talk about what wasn't being talked about at the main event, which was colonized people and the rest of the world. She became quite a sensation there. For example, she was sitting at a restaurant, a gaggle of people saw her and mobbed her table asking for her autograph, and seated right next to her with no attention was Hollywood legend James Cagney. This is just an example of her popularity at this stage. In 1946, though, this I think is her most important intervention. She led India's delegation to the United Nations, and there took up cause of Indians in South Africa, which had passed something called the Ghetto Act, and that was targeting and marginalizing them. And so she framed her arguments in the language of human rights. This is before the establishment of the commission and based on the language of the charter. This becomes a very significant combat because the lead speaker on the other side is Jan Smuts of South Africa, but are also defended by the likes of Sir Hartley Shawcross of Nuremberg fame from Great Britain, who was supporting South Africa's case, at least publicly. She basically leads her point of view to victory. She wins a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. And this becomes a landmark case because South Africa's defense rests on Article 2.7 of the UN Charter, which is the Domestic Jurisdiction Clause, claiming that anything that happens within the purview of a state is protected by domestic jurisdiction, and therefore the UN and international community have no say. But it was decided then, and through this vote, that that was not so. And that precedent, Assistant Secretary General Henri Logier, when he launched the Human Rights Commission shortly thereafter in 1947, noted that this event, this victory by her on South Africa, set the precedent that established the basis on which human rights were now something that could be made into something real for institutionally for the UNO and for the world. So just as a closing point here, although of course I could talk forever about this, but as a closing point, I would just say that some of the other speakers, especially at the outset, have noted that we're at an inflection point, and while positivity was emphasized, we've also noted how there has been some pushback and that this is disturbing and challenging. So on this point, I just want to say that Madam Pandit faced this in her time as well, when her niece, Indira Gandhi, suspended the Indian Constitution, declared an emergency, and suspended civil liberties and rolled back rights. She herself Madam Pandit was placed under house arrest, for example. But after a year of putting up with that, decided silence was just not an option. And she kind of came roaring out of retirement, led the charge internationally and domestically, and ultimately helped force her niece to call an end to the emergency, to call for new elections. And then she campaigned vociferously against her niece, Madam Pandit did, and won, stopping the tide of authoritarianism and restoring democracy. And in that, I think, is our most important lesson about what is possible, what remains necessary, and how to move forward. So I thank you for your time and your attention and for having me here, and I look forward to the remainder of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm just so thrilled to hear about your book and your insights. I think that Madam Pandit was often, relegated in some ways to just being the sister of a more famous man. And I feel that your work has done so much to help stand her up, as she deserves to be in her own right, for the important diplomat that she was on behalf of her country. And I certainly take your final point as well about the lessons that we can actually learn from how important this work continues to be and how difficult it can sometimes be, even with one's own family, from that example that you have shared with us. So we are running a tiny bit short on time. So we have a question that I think is very, very helpful. And I'd like to share the question with all of the panelists. And if we could go around and have each one of your thoughts on this final question, which is really around how do we continue breaking down these systemic barriers that are still facing women. And then we'll do our best to wrap up on time at about 10:30. So here's our question, if I may, to our panelists for each of you to consider in a short response. And it is from Ala Rama, first-year Master of Science in Health Equity student at Mary Hari Medical College. So thank you for organizing the event. Very insightful, inspiring. The women who shaped the Universal Declaration of Human Rights fought to embed equity, dignity, and justice into global frameworks. However, marginalized communities, particularly women of color and those in post-conflict regions, still face systemic barriers in accessing fundamental rights like healthcare, education, and bodily autonomy. In what ways can we build upon their legacies to ensure that human rights frameworks not only acknowledge these disparities, but actively dismantle the structural inequalities that sustain them? And how do we hold institutions accountable for truly making human rights universal? So, if I may, it's a big question, but if I could ask each of our panelists to be quite brief, maybe we'll just go in reverse order now. If that is okay, Professor Bhagavan, perhaps I could ask you to take a brief stab at this, and then we'll pass it to the other panelists as well for a short answer on this one. Thank you.
Sure. Great question. I look forward to more learned answers than mine. But what I would say briefly is that really, the answer is all of us. There is no other way. We are the United Nations. The United Nations is an institution, it's true, but it is representative of and involves all people. And so ultimately, the only way while charters and language and legalisms are important and critically important, it's ultimately up to each individual to stand up in individual settings and to say that these things are necessary, that we must stand for these values and these principles and to fight for the ideals which we believe are not just important, but indeed critical to a future world of justice and peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Adame, please.
Oh wow, how do you second that? You're so inspirational when you speak. I would say that intersectional solidarity is also a way forward, because it's a way to show that minorities are actually not in a minority, they're in a majority, and the privileged few who usually talk about themselves as the majority groups are actually in minority. So if we would have like more intersectional solidarity all over the world, I think that we could create more democratic and human rights respecting both governments and institutions to uphold both, political and civil and economic rights. But then, we need to question the minorities that are now, profiting from people's despair.
Thank you, Dr. Adame. Mrs. Fierst, if I may, we'd love to get your thoughts on this question as well. You just need to unmute yourself, if you would.
Forget that.
Thank you.
Okay, I think you can hear me now. Yeah, I just want to return just really quickly to her, Eleanor Roosevelt's one of her last speeches at the UN, and her most famous line that I think people always, when they're talking about the UDHR, they preface it. This is, so where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, and places so small they can't be seen on any map, which really sort of gets back to her main focus on the development of civil society, which leads to human rights and a recognition of human rights. And that if the answer to that woman's wonderful question was, go to your own community, and if you don't see things that are happening the way they should, you go to your elected officials, you go to your city council, and you make a stink. And it gets back to John Lewis, get into good trouble, right? His comment, and really that does get down to, in a respectful way, taking it kind of to the people who are creating these problems and these injustices. So, on a local basis is kind of where I'm landing on this.
Thank you. And if we may, we'd love also to hear from Excellency Mongella as well. If you're still with us, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. You would also need to unmute. Thank you, Excellency.
Yes, thank you very much. During the preparations of Beijing, this was also an area which was very where human rights was discussed, and the conference came after the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, and I think this is a very important issue. And when it comes to how do we go about this issue, one is, I do also agree that the structures in society bring about discrimination. And if you ask that question, why are these structures in position, the economic, social, political structures, which discriminate women, then you find out that it's just an ordinary struggle for power. That the men, I think, thought it was where the women would take part of the power. But I think we should start to change the mindset. And we can only do that if the mindset is of women, mindset of men is changed. We have to work together, the men and women, to change the structures and positions which bring about this discrimination. But above all, we also have to have peace. Peace, without peace, we cannot change the world, because we have seen so many areas of conflict. Women suffer the most. The Congo, DRC. I have almost gone to most countries which had conflicts in Africa. and it is the women suffer, not
Mm.
only the human rights issue, but the women suffer a lot, and we have to stop the conflicts and wars for any reason. So changing structures and protecting peace.
Mm. Thank you so much, Excellency. Changing structures and working for peace. We thank you for your very wise words today. I thank all of our panelists. This has been an incredibly rich discussion at a really important moment for women's and girls' rights all over the world. I really can't thank all of our panelists enough. I think some of our key takeaways, I really appreciate, again, Excellency Mangala, your point too about how important it is to just change the mindsets, right? So that we can really bring about this equality between men and women. And that sometimes it does come down to just a simple struggle for power, but without that underpinning of peace, which is at the very heart of what the work of the UN is, in fact. So I thank you again for bringing that into our conversation. Mrs. Fierce, thank you so much. Your work.
You're welcome.
Yes, of course.
It's been a privilege for me to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I found your point around, Eleanor Roosevelt's, understanding of the UDHR in small places and so small on maps that we don't even know where they are, and that the localization of the work that we must do in communities. I think that was a really important insight that you shared with us as well. Dr. Adame, we thank you as well for your incredible insights. And I think your point about the intersectional solidarity is something that we can all take away, that we need much more of this intersectional solidarity all over the world, and especially right now. And Professor Bhagavan, I think you took the words out of all of our mouths when you said that the UN is all of us. It is an institution indeed, we the peoples of the United Nations. It doesn't actually read we the governments of the United Nations. It actually does read we the peoples of the United Nations. And I think the more we understand that we in fact are the UN, I do think that that helps us to continue walking on this long road that Her Excellency talked about at the very beginning of our event. So please, if I could, again, thank you. I think the audience is sharing, I guess it's like this, in a virtual reality, but we're applauding you for sharing your time and your thoughts and your insights and your wisdom. I also take this opportunity to thank ASG, Brands Karis from OHCHR. I think her remarks really framed this in a human rights framing. So I thank ASG, and I also thank Nanette Braun, one of our directors here in the Department of Global Communications, for her insightful framing as we began. And really, we offer our gratitude to all of the colleagues who made this happen. I want to especially thank Goja and Kauri from the United Nations academic team, and also Laura from OHCHR, and of course Paulina from the human rights team here in the Department of Global Communications, and all of our team members as well, Lilia and Yushwan and Akshaya, and all of the other team members. We are so grateful. And we will have this online, and we will share the program with everyone who attended, so you'll have it in the future. And we are also asking if everyone could kindly take a moment to scan the QR code or click the link displayed on your screen to access our evaluation survey. Your feedback is just invaluable to us to helping enhance our future events. So we really, really appreciate your time and input if you're able to do that. Thank you, everybody.